Hello everyone and welcome to Word of Mouth. For those of you who don't know, Word of Mouth is an adult story time presented by the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. Word of Mouth is presented on the first and third Thursdays of every month. My name is Andrew Foster and I'll be reading our stories today. Our stories are The Cop and the Anthem by O. Henry and Nail Soup, which is a folktale from Sweden. If you enjoyed today's readings and would like to watch the next program, Word of Mouth is broadcast on the first and third Thursdays, like I said, at 12:10 p.m. Central Time. You can watch it live through the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial's Facebook page, that's at MCCPL Morgan, or you can watch it later on the Montgomery City County Public Library's YouTube page. I believe that's all the announcements I have for today, so let's begin our first story. The Cop and the Anthem by O. Henry. On his bench in Madison Square, Soapy moved uneasily. When wild geese honk high of nights, and when women without sealskin coats grow kind to their husbands, and when Soapy moves uneasily on his bench in the park, you may know that winter is near at hand. A dead leaf fell in Soapy's lap. That was Jack Frost's card. Jack is kind to the regular denizens of Madison Square, and gives fair warning of his annual call. At the corners of 4 streets he hands his white pasteboard to the North Wind, footman of the mansion of all outdoors, so that the inhabitants thereof may make ready. Soapy's mind was cognizant of the fact that the time had come for him to resolve himself into a singular committee of ways and means to provide against the coming rigor, and therefore he moved uneasily on his bench. The hymenetorial ambitions of Soapy were not of the highest. In them there were no considerations of Mediterranean cruises, of soporific southern skies drifting in the Vesuvian Bay. 3 months on the island was what his soul craved. 3 months of assured board and bed and congenial company, safe from Boreas and the bluecoats, seemed to Soapy the essence of things desirable. For years the hospitable Blackwells had been his winter quarters, just as his more fortunate fellow New Yorkers had bought their tickets to Palm Beach and the Riviera each winter. So Soapy had made his humble arrangements for his annual heshra to the island. And now the time was come. On the previous night, 3 sapped newspapers, distributed beneath his coat, about his ankles and over his lap, had failed to repulse the cold as he slept on his bench near the spurting fountain in the ancient square. So the island loomed big and timely in Soapy's mind. He scorned the provisions made in the name of charity for the city's dependents. In Soapy's opinion, the law was more benign than philanthropy. There was an endless round of institutions, municipal and eleemosynary, on which he might set out and receive lodging and food accordant with the simple life. But to one of Soapy's proud spirit, the gifts of charity are encumbered. If not in coin, you must pay in humiliation of spirit for every benefit received at the hands of philanthropy. As Caesar had his Brutus, every bed of charity must have its toll of a bath, every loaf of bread its compensation of a private and personal inquisition. Wherefore it is better to be a guest of the law, though which, conducted by rules, does not meddle unduly with a gentleman's private affairs. Soapy, having decided to go to the island, at once set about accomplishing his desire. There were many easy ways of doing this. The pleasantest was to dine luxuriously at some expensive restaurant, and then, after declaring insolvency, be handed over quietly and without uproar to a policeman. An accommodating magistrate would do the rest. Soapy left his bench and strolled out of the square and across the level sea of asphalt where Broadway and Fifth Avenue flowed together. Up Broadway he turned and halted at a glittering cafe, where are gathered together nightly the choicest products of the grape, the silkworm, and the protoplasm. Soapy had confidence in himself from the lowest button of his vest upward. He was shaven, and his coat was decent, and his neat, black, ready-tied four-in-hand had been presented to him by a lady missionary on Thanksgiving Day. If he could reach a table in the restaurant unsuspected, success would be his. The portion of him that would show above the table would raise no doubt in the waiter's mind. A roasted mallard duck, thought Soapy, would be about the thing, with a bottle of Chablis, and then camembert, a demi-tasse, and a cigar. $1 for the cigar would be enough. The total would not be so high as to call forth any supreme manifestation of revenge from the cafe management, and yet the meal would leave him filled and happy for the journey to his winter's refuge. But as Soapy set foot inside the restaurant door, the head waiter's eye fell upon his frayed trousers and decadent shoes. Strong and ready hands turned him about and conveyed him in silence and haste to the sidewalk and averted his ignoble fate of the menaced mallard. Soapy turned off Broadway. It seemed that his route to the coveted island was not to be an Epicurean one. Some other way of entering limbo must be thought of. At a corner of 6th Avenue, electric lights and cunningly displayed wares behind plate glass made a shop window conspicuous. Soapy took a cobblestone and dashed it through the glass. People came running around the corner, a policeman in the lead. Soapy stood still with his hands in his pockets and smiled at the sight of the brass buttons. "Where's the man that done this?" inquired the officer excitedly. "Don't you figure that I might have had something to do with it?" said Soapy, not without sarcasm, but friendly, as one greets good fortune. The policeman's mind refused to accept Soapy even as a clue. Men who smash windows do not remain to parley with the law's minions. They take to their heels. The policeman saw a man halfway down the block running to catch a car. With drawn club, he joined in the pursuit. Soapy, with disgust in his heart, loafed along, twice unsuccessful. On the opposite side of the street was a restaurant of no great pretensions. It catered to large appetites and modest purses. Its crockery and atmosphere were thick, its soup and napery thin. Into this place Soapy took his effusive shoes and telltale trousers without challenge. At a table he sat and consumed beefsteak, flapjacks, donuts, and pie, and then to the waiter he betrayed the fact that the minutest coin and himself were strangers. "Now get busy and call a cop," said Soapy, "and don't keep a gentleman waiting." "No cop for use," said the waiter, with a voice like butter cakes and an eye like a cherry in a Manhattan cocktail. "Hey, con!" Neatly upon his left ear on the callous pavement, 2 waiters pitched Soapy. He arose joint by joint, as a carpenter's rule opens, and beat the dust from his clothes. Arrest seemed but a rosy dream. The island seemed very far away. A policeman who stood before a drugstore 2 doors away laughed and walked down the street. 5 blocks Soapy traveled before his courage permitted him to woo capture again. This time the opportunity presented what he fatuously termed to himself a cinch. A young woman of modest and pleasing guise was standing before a shop window, gazing with sprightly interest at its display of shaving mugs and inkstands. And 2 yards from the window, a large policeman of severe demeanor leaned against a water plug. It was Soapy's design to assume the role of the despicable and execrated masher. The refined and elegant appearance of his victim and the contiguity of the conscientious cop encouraged him to believe that he would soon feel the pleasant official clutch upon his arm that would ensure his winter's quarters on the tight little island. Soapy straightened the lady missionary's ready-made tie, dragged his shrinking cuffs into the open, set his hat at a killing cant, and sidled towards the young woman. He made eyes at her, was taken with sudden coughs and hems, smiled, smirked, and went brazenly through the impudent and contemptible litany of the masher. With half an eye, Soapy saw that the policeman was watching him fixedly. The young woman moved away a few steps and again bestowed her absorbed attention upon the shaving mugs. Soapy followed, boldly stepping to her side, raised his hat, and said, "Ah, there, Bedelia, don't you want to come and play in my yard?" The policeman was still looking. The persecuted young woman had but to beckon a finger, and Soapy would be practically en route for his insular haven. Already imagined that he could feel the cozy warmth of the station house. The young woman faced him, and stretching out a hand, caught Soapy's coat sleeve. "Sure, Mike," she said joyfully. "If you'll blow me to a pail of suds, I'd have spoke to you sooner, but the cop was watching." With the young woman playing the clinging ivy to his oak, Soapy walked past the policeman, overcome with gloom. He seemed doomed to liberty. At the next corner, he shook off his companion and ran. He halted in the district where by night are found the lightest streets, harps, vows, and librettos. Women in furs and men in greatcoats moved gaily in the wintry air. A sudden fear seized Soapy that some dreadful enchantment had rendered him immune to arrest. The thought brought a little panic upon it, and when he came upon another policeman lounging grandly in front of a transplendent theater, he caught at the immediate straw of disorderly conduct. On the sidewalk, Soapy began to yell drunken gibberish at the top of his harsh voice. He danced, howled, raved, and otherwise disturbed the welkin. The policeman twirled his club, turned his back to Soapy, and remarked to a citizen, "'Tis one of them Yale lads celebrating the goose egg they give to the Hartford College. Noisy, but no harm. We've instructions to leave them be." Disconsolate, Soapy ceased his unavailing racket. Would never a policeman lay hands on him? In his fancy, the island seemed an unattainable Arcadia. He buttoned his thin coat against the chilling wind. In a cigar store he saw a well-dressed man lighting a cigar at a swinging light. His silk umbrella he had set by the door on entering. Soapy stepped inside, secured the umbrella, and sauntered off with it slowly. The man at the cigar light followed hastily. "My umbrella," he said sternly. "Oh, is it?" sneered Soapy, adding insult to petite larceny. "Well, why don't you call a policeman? I took it, your umbrella. Why don't you call a cop? There stands one at the corner." The umbrella owner slowed his steps. Soapy did likewise, with a presentiment that luck would again run against him. The policeman looked at the two curiously. "Of course," said the umbrella man, "that is, well, you know how these mistakes occur. If it's your umbrella, I hope you'll excuse me. I picked it up this morning in a restaurant. If you recognize it as yours, I hope you'll—" "Of course it's mine," said Soapy viciously. The ex-umbrella man retreated. The policeman hurried to assist a tall blonde in an opera cloak across the street, in front of a streetcar that was approaching 2 blocks away. Soapy walked eastward through a street damaged by improvements. He hurled the umbrella wrathfully into an excavation. He muttered against the men who wear helmets and carry clubs. Because he wanted to fall into their clutches, they seemed to regard him as a king who could do no wrong. At length, Soapy reached one of the avenues to the east, where the glitter and turmoil was but faint. He set his face down this toward Madison Square, for the homing instinct survives, even when the home is a park bench. But on an unusually quiet corner, Soapy came to a standstill. Here was an old church, quaint and rambling and gabled. Through one violet-stained window, a soft light glowed, where, no doubt, the organist loitered over the keys, making sure of his mastery of the coming Sabbath anthem. For there drifted out to Soapy's sweet ears music that caught and held him transfixed against the convolutions of the iron fence. The moon was above, lustrous and serene. Vehicles and pedestrians were few. Sparrows twittered sleepily in the eaves. For a little while, the scene might have been a country churchyard, and the anthem that the organist played cemented Soapy to the iron fence. For he had known it well in the days when his life contained such things as mothers, and roses, and ambitions, and friends, and immaculate thoughts and colors. The conjunction of Soapy's receptive state of mind and the influences about the old church wrought a sudden and wonderful change in his soul. He viewed with swift horror the pit into which he had tumbled, the degraded days, unworthy desires, dead hopes, wrecked facilities, and base motives that made up his existence. And also in a moment his heart responded thrillingly to his novel mood. An instantaneous and strong impulse moved him to battle with his desperate fate. He would pull himself out of the mire. He would make a man of himself again. He would conquer the evil that had taken possession of him. There was time. He was comparatively young yet. He would resurrect his old eager ambitions and pursue them without faltering. Those solemn but sweet organ notes had set up a revolution in him. Tomorrow he would go into the roaring downtown district and find work. A fur importer had once offered him a place as a driver. He would find him tomorrow and ask for a petition. He would be somebody in the world. Soapy felt a hand on his arm. He looked quickly around into the broad face of a policeman. "What are you doing here?" asked the officer. "Nothing," said Soapy. "Then come along," said the policeman. 3 months on the island," said the magistrate in the next morning. Book 2. Nail Soup, which is a Swedish folktale. There was once a tramp who went plodding his way through a forest. The distance between the houses was so great that he had little hope of finding a shelter before the night set in. But all of a sudden he saw some lights between the trees. He then discovered a cottage. There was a fire burning on the hearth. How nice it would be to roast oneself before that fire and get a bite of something, he thought. And so he dragged himself toward the cottage. Just then an old woman came towards him. "Good evening and well met," said the tramp. "Good evening," said the woman. "Where do you come from?" "South of the sun and east of the moon," said the tramp, "and now I'm on my way home again, for I have been all over the world, with the exception of this parish," he said. "You must be a great traveler then," said the woman. "What may be your business here?" "Oh, I want shelter for the night," he said. "Oh, I thought as much," said the woman. "But you may as well get away from here at once, for my husband is not at home, and my place is not an inn," she said. "My good woman," said the tramp, "you must not be so cross and hard-hearted, for we are both human beings, and we should help one another, it is written." "Help one another," said the woman. "Help, did you ever hear such a thing? Who will help me, do you think? I haven't got a morsel in the house. No, you'll have to look for your quarters elsewhere," she said. But the tramp was like the rest of his kind. He did not consider himself beaten at the first rebuff. Although the old woman grumbled and complained as much as she could, he was just as persistent as ever, and went on begging and praying like a starved dog, until at last she gave in, and he got permission to lie on the floor for the night. That was very kind, he thought, and he thanked her for it. "Better on the floor without sleep than suffer cold in forest deep," he said, for he was a merry fellow, this tramp, and was always ready with a rhyme. When he came into the room, he could see that the woman was not so badly off as she had pretended. But she was a greedy and stingy woman of the worst sort, and was always complaining and trembling. He now made himself very agreeable, of course, and asked her in his most insinuating manner for something to eat. "Where am I to get it from?" said the woman. "I haven't tasted a morsel myself the whole day." But the tramp was a cunning fellow, he was. "Poor old granny, you must be starving," he said. "Well, well, I suppose I shall have to ask you to have something with me then." "Have something with you?" said the woman. "You don't look as if you could ask anyone to have anything. What have you got to offer one, I should like to know?" "He who far and wide does roam sees many things not known at home, and he who many things has seen has wits about him and senses keen," said the tramp. "Better dead than lose one's head. Lend me a pot, granny." The old woman now became very inquisitive, as you may guess, and so she let him have a pot. He filled it with water and put it on the fire, and then he blew with all his might till the fire was burning fiercely all round it. Then he took a 4-inch nail from his pocket, turned it 3 times in his hand, and put it into the pot. The old woman stared with all her might. "What's this going to be?" she asked. "Nail broth," said the tramp, and began to stir the water with the porridge stick. "Nail broth?" asked the woman. "Yes, nail broth," said the tramp. The old woman had seen and heard a good deal in her time, but that anybody would have made broth with a nail, well, she had never heard the like before. "That's something for poor people to know," she said, "and I should like to learn how to make it." "That which is not worth knowing will always go begging," said the tramp. But if she wanted to learn how to make it, she only had to watch, he said, and he went on stirring. The old woman squatted on the ground, her hands clasping her knees, and her eyes following his hand as he stirred the broth. "This generally makes good broth," he said, "but this time it will very likely be rather thin, for I have been making broth the whole week with the same nail. If one only had a handful of sifted oatmeal to put in, that would make it all right," he said, "but what one has to go without." It's no use thinking more about. And so he stirred the broth again. "Well, I think I have a scrap of flour somewhere," said the old woman, and went out to fetch some, and it was both good and fine. The tramp began putting the flour into the broth, and went on stirring, while the woman sat staring now at him, and then at the pot, until her eyes nearly burst their sockets. "This broth would be good enough for company," he said, putting in one handful of flour after another. "If I had only a bit of salted beef, and a few potatoes to put in, it would be fit for gentlefolks, however particular they might be," he said. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about." When the old woman really began to think it over, she thought she had some potatoes and perhaps a bit of beef as well, and these she gave the tramp, who went on stirring while she sat and stared as hard as ever. "This will be grand enough for the best in the land," he said. "Well, I never," said the woman. "And just fancy, all with a nail." He was really a wonderful man, that tramp. He could do more than drink a sup and turn the tankard up, he could. "If one only had a little barley and a drop of milk, we could ask the king himself to have some of it," he said. "For this is what he has every blessed evening. That I know, for I have been in service under the king's cook," he said. "Dear me, ask the king to have some? Hell, I never," exclaimed the woman, slapping her knees. She was quite awestruck at the tramp and his grand connections. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about," he said. And then she remembered she had a little barley, and as for milk, well, she wasn't quite out of that, she said, for her best cow had just calved. And then she went to fetch both the one and the other. The tramp went on stirring, and the woman sat staring, one moment at him, and the next at the pot. Then all at once the tramp took out the nail. "Now it's ready, and now we'll have a real good feast," he said. "But to this kind of soup the king and queen always take a dram or two, and one sandwich at least. Then they always have a cloth on the table when they eat," he said. "But what one has to go without, it's no use thinking more about." But by this time the old woman herself had begun to feel quite grand and fine, I can tell you. And if that was all that was wanted, to make it just as the king had it, she thought it would be nice to have it just the same way for once, and play at being king and queen with the tramp. She went straight to a cupboard and brought out the brandy bottle, dram glasses, butter and cheese, smoked beef and veal, until at last the table looked as if it had been decked out for company. Never in her life had the old woman had such a grand feast, and never had she tasted such broth. And just fancy, made with only a nail. She was in such a good and merry humor at having learned such an economical way of making broth, that she did not know how to make enough of the tramp who had taught her such a useful thing. So they ate and drank and ate, until they became both tired and sleepy. The tramp was now going to lie down on the floor, but that would never do, thought the old woman. No, that was impossible. Such a grand person must have a bed to lie in, she said. He did not need much pressing. It's just like sweet Christmas time, he said, and a nicer woman I never came across. Well, happy are they who meet with such good people, said he, and he lay down on the bed and went to sleep. And the next morning when he woke, the first thing he got was coffee and a dram. When he was going, the old woman gave him a bright dollar piece. And thanks, many thanks for what you have taught me, she said, for I shall now live in comfort, since I have learned how to make broth with a nail. Well, it isn't very difficult if one only has something to add to it, said the tramp, and he went on his way. The woman stood at the door staring after him. Such people don't grow on every bush, she said. The end. Well, hopefully you enjoyed this week's stories. I enjoyed reading them. Hopefully you'll join us 2 weeks from today on November the 19th for our next Word of Mouth. Everyone have a wonderful day. We'll see you then.